Wilkinson, who's the MP from North Vancouver, but also he's the Minister of Fisheries, Oceans, and the Canadian Coast Guard. And Jonathan, or Minister Wilkinson, has deep roots in North Vancouver. He spent the last 16 years raising his family, and he has a personal interest in Canada's environmental stewardship, which is great to be the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans. He's focusing on developing a greener economy with an emphasis on Canadian clean tech, moving from local to global reach. The Honourable Minister Wilkinson is a Rhodes Scholar, which in case you guys wonder means he's really smart. He made use of educational background in public policy, and he worked as a constitutional negotiator and a federal provincial relations specialist. He served on several industry and charitable boards, including United Way of Lower Mainland, BC Technology Industry Association, and the Walter and Duncan Gordon Foundation. Minister Wilkinson served as Parliamentary Secretary from 2015 to 2018 when he got the big promotion to the Minister of Fisheries, Oceans, and Canadian Coast Guard. So, Honourable Minister, please come forward.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you here today. Bonjour, bon après-midi à tous. Before we begin, I would start by acknowledging that this event is taking place on the traditional territory of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. Before I entered politics in 2015, so this is my first term in office, I had spent the previous 20 plus years in the private sector. I was CEO of a number of clean tech companies here in British Columbia for a little over 15 years, and before that I worked for a global management consultancy based in their Toronto office. I made the decision to enter politics in large measure because of my concerns as a parent of climate change. But I also got into politics because I felt that Canada under the previous government was lacking and very much in need of a more thoughtful approach to economic strategy. What I did not see and what I felt we needed was an economic approach that focused on strengthening core infrastructure and business confidence, but that was also focused on strengthening Canada's middle class, ensuring that this country, as it moved forward, that all Canadians move forward. In 2015 and today, more than ever, we need a strategy that looked ahead as to thoughtfully position Canada in a way that will enable prosperity today, but also prosperity tomorrow. We also needed an economic strategy that recognized that we could no longer afford to ignore impacts on our environment. Climate change is an existential threat to human beings. It is an existential threat to the future of this world. We could also not ignore the significant threats posed by the loss of biodiversity in this world. Going forward, economic strategy would need to take account of and accommodate these critical environmental realities. Our government came to power almost 4 years ago. As you know, there's an election looming in October. Unemployment was stubbornly high. Wages were stagnant. Consumer confidence was in decline. Growth under the previous government was the slowest that had been on record since R.B. Bennett and the Great Depression. Economic strategy was largely based on trickle-down economics and on simply looking to enhance resource extraction to facilitate future growth. Canada's economic strategy ignored the reality of climate change, and it was deaf to concerns with respect to increasing biodiversity loss in this country and around the world. Since 2015, Canada's economy has rebounded. We now have one of the strongest records of growth in the G7. Our plan to invest in trade-enabling infrastructure, in growing Canada's trading relationships, in looking to future industries in which Canada either has or can reasonably be expected to develop a sustainable competitive advantage in the world, and investing in the middle class is working. Since 2015, Canadians have created over 1 million new jobs, most of those full-time jobs, pushing unemployment to a 40-year low. The average family is $2,000 better off. Over 800,000 Canadians, including more than 300,000 Canadian children, have been lifted out of poverty. And we have begun the task of positioning Canada for the economy and the jobs of the future. Strengthening Canada's economy now and for the future is being accomplished in a number of different ways, and I'll just mention a few. Infrastructure, we have made historic investments in infrastructure. More than 33,000 projects have been approved in the years since 2015, creating good middle-class jobs in communities right across this country. The new economic activity has helped to spur the creation of jobs, strengthen communities, enhanced environmental protection, and is certainly fortifying Canada's export capacity. Trade. As all of you in this room will know very well, Canada is a very large country with a pretty small population. We are rich in natural resources and are home to a wide range of innovative people and innovative companies. Trade with the rest of the world has long been extremely important for a country like Canada. As the pace of change accelerates, as human capital becomes increasingly important as a driver of economic prosperity and growth, and as scale continues to play a dominant role in the success of many industries, the ability to trade freely with countries around the world becomes ever more important. This is precisely why we have focused very much on trade, both stability in terms of existing arrangements and the development of access to new markets. They've been a centerpiece of our economic strategy. In this regard, our government has pursued and successfully advanced the development of 3 new trade agreements, the first being the new NAFTA, the second being the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the third being the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement between Canada and the European Union. Canada is now the only country in the G7 with free trade access to North America, Europe, and Asia concurrently. These trade agreements offer enormous opportunity for Canadian businesses and for investment in Canada. In terms of the business environment, we have focused very much on ensuring small and medium-sized businesses are able to invest their profits back into growing their business, and therefore we lowered significantly the small business tax rate. This gives small business owners significant tax savings and means that Canada has one of the very lowest small business tax rates in the world. This means our entrepreneurs and our business owners can grow their operations, hire more Canadians, and invest in their communities. We also have focused on cutting red tape, and most particularly, we have led a conversation with the provinces on the reduction of interprovincial trade barriers. It is often true to say that trade between Canadian provinces can at times be more challenging than trade with other countries. With respect to Canada's middle class, we have strengthened the position and the purchasing power of Canada's middle class and of those working hard to join it. This is the product of policies like the Canada Child Benefit, which is focused on ensuring middle-class families have the resources that they need to have a fair chance at success. And with respect to the economy of the future, we have worked actively with industry to develop what we call the supercluster approach, focusing public and private sector investments in areas that are likely to be key drivers of growth in the future, in which Canada has or can reasonably develop a sustainable competitive advantage. Our government has invested $950 million to support these industry-led innovation superclusters across the country. They are aimed at accelerating economic growth, productivity, and competitiveness. This includes the ocean supercluster on the East Coast, and it very much includes the digital supercluster based right here in British Columbia. The BC-based digital technology supercluster received $153 million in funding. As an industry-led consortium, this supercluster will leverage BC's strengths and position Canada as a global hub for digital technology, generating new jobs, growing GDP, and increasing Canada's global competitiveness in the world. This will be done to improve service delivery for many, many different kinds of industries, including the natural resource sector. We expect this to add more than 13,500 new jobs and more than $5 billion to the economy over the next 10 years. This is something that was developed by the BC business community. Some of the senior leaders within the BC business community were heavily involved in the development of this initiative and continue to be heavily involved in the work that is going on within the supercluster. People like Greg Davignon at the BC Business Council, like Bill Tam, who used to be the CEO of the BC Tech Industries Association, people like Sue Page, who used to run Life Labs and Pharmacy. And clean tech. Another part of any future-oriented economic plan is investing in clean technology. In a world where climate change has emerged as a real and a very imminent threat, a comprehensive approach to addressing this threat is certainly required. Any realistic approach requires a detailed plan to mitigate and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. A real climate plan must involve initiatives to move away from high carbon fuels, to move towards electrification of transportation, to enhance building efficiency, and other measures. A real, effective, and efficient climate plan prices pollution. It also needs to have a thoughtful approach to the development and the deployment of technology that can assist with the climate challenge. Climate change is an environmental threat, but it can also be seen very much as an economic opportunity. Countries that recognize the markets that will be available for technologies that reduce the human footprint on this planet will have a sustainable competitive advantage in markets that will grow going forward. Our government has developed a detailed, comprehensive clean tech strategy, one that is focused on the growth of small companies into medium-sized companies and ultimately into large companies through a range of different tools. Companies in BC that have benefited from investments in this space include companies like General Fusion in Burnaby, like Carbon Engineering in Squamish, like Inventus, a carbon capture company also in Burnaby, EcoAtion, which is an ag tech company in North Vancouver. Our government's economic plan is thoughtful, it is strategic, and it is working. It is a plan that recognizes that in the modern world, economic progress and environmental sustainability must go hand in hand. Let me be very pointed and very clear on this last point. Climate change is an existential threat to this planet. It is a hugely concerning threat for the prospects of our children and our grandchildren. The environmental and economic impacts of climate change are already with us today, whether it is the melting Arctic ice and permafrost in the north, the changing food patterns for North Atlantic right whales, which is causing so many problems for us on the eastern coast of Canada, or the warming waters here in BC that are causing increasingly significant challenges for wild Pacific salmon and the survival of the southern resident killer whale. Biodiversity loss is also with us today, and it is accelerating. A recent World Wildlife Fund report showed that in the last 40 years, the world has lost 60% of its biodiversity. That is a stunning figure, and it is one that is intimately linked to climate change. It is something that ultimately will have very grave consequences for human health on a global basis. Going forward, economic strategy must account for these issues, and it must strive to ensure that economic progress and environmental sustainability can indeed go together. This is something we have, as a government, have worked very hard to do. As we approach October of 2019 and the federal election that will be held then, I would suggest to all of you that any political leader that aspires to be Prime Minister of this country should have an economic plan that also addresses critical environmental challenges, most particularly the climate challenge. The days in which governments simply focus on economic growth without consideration for our environment should very much be over. We should all be demanding of our political leaders that they provide real and reasonable answers that address both economic and environmental imperatives. So in closing, I would say that we as Canadians, I think, have made a lot of progress over the last 4 years, both economic and environmental. We have, I believe, begun to establish a thoughtful baseline and a foundation for a prosperous and a sustainable future for Canada. And with that, I would be very happy to answer any questions that folks may have.
Be nice. Honorable Minister, there's been some controversy over the last while as to how liberal British Columbia's or Canada's fish farming regulations have been. I know I'm sort of bringing you back a little closer to home here. But I was recently in Alaska and was quite blown away by the fact that fish farming is illegal in Alaska. They have something called fish ranching.
Yeah, ranching, yeah.
And it's a staggeringly more productive model, really, than what we have here. As I understand it, we've become a bit of a reprieve from fish farmers being thrown out of Scandinavia and other regions. Do you have any thoughts on the future of sort of fish production in that kind of context?
Yeah, so I have lots of different thoughts and comments on that. I think there are a few things that you said that are probably not quite correct in terms of fish farms being thrown out of Norway and Scandinavian countries. Certainly, I've been minister now for a little over a year, and I have focused very much on thinking about how we can best incorporate the precautionary approach to the way in which we manage aquaculture. So I think it's fair to say that there are differences of opinion, scientific opinion, on some key questions relating to the impacts that aquaculture may or may not have on the marine environment. Certainly within my department, there's a pretty strong view in the science group that those issues are reasonably managed, but that's not a universal opinion even within the department, and there certainly are others outside the department, including folks in Wild Salmon Forever that Dr. Madden is part of, that have expressed a number of different concerns with respect to specific issues. And so what we have said is that we are going to move forward in much more fully implementing the precautionary principle. We've taken a number of steps towards that. So we've moved towards what we call area-based management, where we look at not siting farms and potentially moving farms, as we are with the government of BC in the Broughton, away from areas where there is wild salmon migration pathways, number one. Number two, we've made a number of determinations recently around how we will handle the issue of viruses, where we are going to be requiring a lot more of the fish farmers with respect to testing on an ongoing basis, and if the testing proves out in a manner that is inconsistent with them being able to actually transfer those fish, then they simply won't do that. We are certainly having conversations about how we can move forward to find a financially viable way to transition to a closed containment system, whether that's on land or in water closed containment systems. And so we commissioned a study to look at exactly that, the state of those systems. And we are looking very actively at if in fact there still are gaps with respect to the cost effectiveness of closed containment, how might we be able to close those gaps through policy instruments to be able to incent the deployment of these types of systems where you further isolate environmental impacts. The Alaskan issue is a little bit different. The ocean ranching is certainly something that is a topic of a lot of conversation. It is actually more akin to very large-scale supplementation, so hatchery production. And in Alaska, it has been quite successful. Those are all basically hatchery fish. They're not wild fish. We do have some concerns about large-scale supplementation unless you do it in the right area, because you can overwhelm the genetics of wild salmon, and we would be concerned about that. You end up with stock that is effectively not wild anymore. But we are looking at the issue around ranching. I would say Alaska has some advantages over us in the sense that the water is still quite cold in Alaska. And so the impacts of climate, I mean, salmon is a cold water fish, and the impacts of climate change are felt much more when water temperatures rise. Last summer we had temperatures on the Fraser and parts of it that were very, very warm, far too warm for salmon to be able to effectively move upriver to spawn. This year we have the same thing on the Skeena. I would say, just with respect to those that are concerned about wild salmon, the concern is warranted. We are seeing declines everywhere, and it's not just 1 year. These are successive declines. We have some particular problems on the Fraser this year with the landslide, but we've seen, effectively a collapse of the stocks going back on the Skeena. We've seen a collapse of the coho coming down from Alaska, and this is a longer-term issue where we're going to have to look at options that maybe we haven't looked at seriously in the past, if we are going to have some kind of a sustainable stock and a sustainable fishery going forward.
When we talk about climate change, everybody talks about it, but they ignore the elephant in the room, which is an enormous population growth in the world. And I don't see any way you're going to create any change in climate change with that type of pressure of people who need resources and the cheapest resource they can get. It's a problem that is not being met by anybody. The Chinese tried it and they've been reasonably successful. Under a totalitarian regime, they can probably get away with that. But what about the rest of us?
So I think it's an important point. I don't fully agree with everything you said, but certainly population growth makes the challenge even more significant, because even if you reduce on a per unit basis the greenhouse gas emissions that we all emit, if your population is growing rapidly, you're kind of using up that room that you've created for yourself. I would say that thinking about how we get to a point on the planet where we're actually not having huge increases in population is an important conversation that obviously has to happen on an international basis. But I would say that if you look at the projections and numbers, it's not quite as dire, I think, as you might think. The history is that as countries develop, population birth rates go down. And so if you look in Southeast Asia, for example, many of those countries have seen essentially stabilization of population. China has largely stabilized population. They may have gone a little far, because now it's kind of going the other way. But the issues right now are Africa and some parts of Asia, like India and Pakistan. And part of this is a question around how we actually incent people to have smaller families. Part of that's about economic security, and the reason why people in countries like ours don't need to have large numbers of children is that you typically are going to expect that your children are going to outlive you. That's not true in Africa. It's not true in some other parts of the country or the world. So we need to look at that for sure, and I think that does need to be part of the conversation. But I would say that there are opportunities available to us, and we need to be pursuing those that actually make substantial reductions in greenhouse gas emissions through the development and the utilization of technology. So if you can find ways to make new forms of energy generation cost-effective relative to existing forms of energy generation, then you can actually do that even in places that are going to be growing and still not increase the problem. Companies like General Fusion out here in Burnaby that are developing nuclear fusion technology, if you can make that work, that's a game changer. If you can continue the cost reduction that we have seen with respect to many kinds of renewables, same thing, that can be a game changer. Things that international organizations and developed countries like ours can help to facilitate in terms of the deployment. So I hear you, and I think it's an important point, but I wouldn't be quite so skeptical about the opportunities that are ahead of us in terms of GHG reduction.
Is there a question back here, and then Michael first?
Thank you, Minister. Looking at the global picture aside of population, we have a president down south who's clearly totally uninterested in climate change, in fact, negates it. We have a Brazilian president who's encouraging now cutting the Amazon down. We have massive air pollution, urban air pollution in India, huge population. China, same thing. We are a tiny country, as you said. We have less population than California. We have criticism from about the tar sands all the time, what we're doing. How can we, as a tiny country, in the G7 for instance, have any hope of influencing world attitudes and opinion with us, as we are?
So I would say a few things to that. Canada is a small country from a population perspective, but we actually produce 2% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, so we are not insignificant in the discussion. We are a country that believes that the world on a collective basis needs to make progress on this issue. And we need, if we are going to be taking that position internationally and trying to find ways to engage others to pursue that kind of an agenda, we obviously need to walk the walk. That means we need to be able to ensure that we are achieving the targets we've committed to under Paris. And we need to go far beyond after 2050. We need to be, from the scientists will tell you, we need to get to the point where we're effectively net zero by 2050. So we need to be able to walk the walk domestically, and we need to be working with countries around the world, both at the political level, but also through work we can do with developing countries to enable them to actually make jumps with respect to how they grow their energy systems that don't require you to go through the hydrocarbon phase, or at least not in the same way. I would tell you that there are certainly bumps in the road. There are always going to be some bumps in the road with respect to international politics. Certainly the current President of the United States has not been as supportive of climate action as President Obama. But I would also tell you that there are many folks in the United States that are incredibly supportive of climate action. And while the American government has not been doing a lot in the last couple of years, the state of California, the state of New York, the state of Massachusetts, and a range of others are continuing right on. So we are part of trying to ensure that we are part of the solution and working with others to try to bring people together to make a difference. At the end of the day, I'm not sure what the alternative is. The alternative is let it go. And I don't think that's a responsible position for a parent or a grandparent or a human being to take, given what we know is going to happen if we do not address this issue.
So Franz was like.
Mine got the third question.
Michael Zerger.
Thank you, Your Honor. Melissa. Just a quick question with regards to, you talked about strategy, but could you give some, maybe a few examples on what are good, like tangible, critical success factors where you say, this is what we really need to get done in order to achieve and to execute on the strategy to get to these tangible results here in Canada?
So, I mean, I think in terms of what you might call the jobs of the future, the focus of that whole supercluster initiative was really around boiling down areas where you could identify reasons why Canada actually could believe that it could be the best in the world. Canada, I mean, as somebody said, Canada is a small, big geographic country, small population. Canada is not a country that's going to be the best at everything in the world. And to the extent that we say we're going to try to do everything at the same time, we're probably going to be successful at nothing. So the whole gist of the supercluster was challenging the private sector to define areas where it believed Canada actually had a legitimate shot at being the best or the second best in the world. And out of that, and the way that the cluster initiative worked was private sectors came together to build a consortium and to actually structure that initiative. And the private sector then selects the companies and the initiatives that actually they're going to partner with to actually move those things forward. It's not the government that does that, it's the private sector. And I think that's part of the answer. I think part of the broader answer outside of a lot of these technology related things is we're going to need to get, and governments in Canada have been saying this for 20 years, a better handle on how we improve productivity in this country. Productivity in this country has lagged our American counterparts for some significant period of time. Canadians we're going to need to find ways to enable Canadian companies to grow and to become more profitable through the use of our brains rather than through the use of just our brute force.
Minister Wilkinson, probably got a poorly formulated question for you, but I'm just...
Sorry, I probably have a poorly formed answer.
Everybody's been pretty quiet in the room about Prime Minister Trudeau and the Liberal government's interaction in regards to pipeline and LNG. Just wondered if you could kind of stitch the idea together about how we get harmony between the two Western provinces and what the impact of tanker traffic might be in fisheries.
Okay.
Let's not do that.
Very easy question. And within that, I think there were embedded a few different questions. So with respect to, let me take the pipeline, then I'll take LNG, and then let me talk about BC Alberta, because those are kind of three related but slightly different things. So the Trans Mountain Pipeline obviously has been the subject of lots of discussion and debate, no doubt, across the country, but certainly in Alberta and British Columbia more than everywhere else. It's certainly an issue I heard a lot about and continue to hear a lot about in North Vancouver. We are just adjacent to where the Westridge Terminal sits and where tankers will go, and every tanker will pass by my riding, every day of every week. So people clearly have lots of thoughts. And when people talk to you about what they're concerned about, there are basically two things. One is, how does this fit with the government's commitment to the climate agenda, number one. And the second is, how can you manage marine shipping in a manner that we can believe it will be safe? Those are both completely legitimate questions. And I think anybody who dismisses the questions out of hand is not being fair to many British Columbians who haven't fully made up their mind about the issue, but really want to understand it. I certainly had many conversations in Ottawa about this before the government made the initial determination to approve the pipeline. At the time, I was the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, so I was working on these issues pretty closely. And I would tell you that folks need to make up their own minds on these kinds of issues. I don't think that it's fair to say that there's one answer, but I will tell you the way in which I explain it to people, which is In the climate piece, we incorporated all of the upstream emissions associated with the oil that will go in the pipeline in Canada's climate plan. And so the plan, in terms of achieving the Paris targets, is consistent with that pipeline. The pipeline itself is, in some respects, I think, a bit of a red herring. The pipeline is a transmission mechanism. It's not the production of oil. If you look at what happened between the beginning of 2016 and the end of 2018, 260,000 barrels of oil more was going by rail over that period, simply because there's no pipeline capacity. That's half, pretty much half of the volume that will go through the expanded pipeline. So unless you're willing to make oil production illegal, it is going to be transported. It is going to be transported in some manner. And the safest way to transport oil is by pipeline, certainly not by rail. So it is consistent with Canada's Paris targets. Over the longer term, it will allow us to extract full value for our product. Right now, 99% of Canadian oil goes to the United States. There's a huge discount we get because we only have one customer. It will allow us to extract full value for our oil during the period where we are going to need to start to transition. And the Paris Agreement, the Pan-Canadian Framework, which is our climate plan under the Paris Agreement, is consistent with that. What I will say to you is, if the world is successful in transitioning away from oil, there will be less demand 20, 30, 40 years from now for oil. That will be from oil from all kinds of sources, not simply from the oil sands. In the shorter term, there will be demand for oil, right? There will be demand for oil. And so if Canada made the decision, for example, not to export any more oil, we could do that tomorrow. But it wouldn't do anything on the climate file. It would be replaced by oil from Saudi Arabia or Iran or Venezuela or somewhere else. So the issue for us is we need to walk the walk in reducing demand for hydrocarbons in Canada. We need to help developing countries reduce demand for hydrocarbons overseas. We need to work with the international community on that. Over time, demand will go down. And no doubt, Alberta and Saskatchewan and British Columbia, to a certain extent with gas, are going to have to learn how to transition their economies. But we need to be smart about using some of the resource rents that we will receive over that period to help transition those economies. On the marine side, I think a lot of folks don't understand that we right now have 3,200 large ships coming into this port every year. Every one of those contains large amounts of bunker C fuel. Bunker C fuel compositionally is not very different from diluted bitumen. And so the issue is not how do you manage 6 more tankers, because we ship bitumen out of the harbor today. It's the number of ships that go out. It's about how do you manage this in a safe way going forward? How do you manage overall shipping traffic in a safe way going forward? And our answer to that was the Oceans Protection Plan, which is $1.5 billion going into prevention of spills and the ability to actually address them if in fact they happen. So every tanker that's going to go out will have 2 tugs tethered to it all the way out. We've bought 2 large towing ships so that we can actually ensure that we can tow if there's any problem with any kind of a large vessel. We've equipped every Canadian Coast Guard vessel with a towing kit. We've put into place the Kitsilano Coast Guard base and bases up and down the coast. There's a whole range of things that we've done to ensure that shipping going forward will actually be safer for all large-scale shipping than it has been in the last 20, 30 years. And so on that basis, I think that the marine shipping piece has been addressed, and it's probably been addressed to the point where we actually are making it better than it was 3 years ago. On Alberta and BC, obviously the spat that has gone on between the two is not helpful or constructive on an interprovincial basis or on a national basis. I think that hopefully some of that acrimony has died down a little bit. I mean, I think the provincial government is now increasingly aware of the fact that they probably don't have jurisdiction here, and so they are understanding that this may not be an issue that they can continue to fight on the go-forward basis. But obviously we would like to see British Columbia and Alberta have better relations on an interprovincial basis, understanding that the 2 premiers are very different people. And we will work hard to try to ensure that. That's the role of the national government, is to try to ensure, even when we don't agree with each other from an ideological perspective, that we can still work together as a country.
So we know how busy these guys are, so I really appreciate him finding the time to be with us today, because not only it's an election year, but also as a minister, kind of family guy. He's got a lot of obligations in the summertime. So on behalf of the Rotary Club, Jonathan, in 1985, Rotary started its quest to end polio. There was 350,000 cases at that time worldwide. Right now we're down to 42, mostly because there's some war-torn regions that we're having trouble getting into, but the fight goes on. So in your name, we made a donation where 50 children will be immunized. So
Wow, thank you.
for coming, and a little bit thank you note from us. So,
Thank you very much.
anyway, thank
That's
you
very
very
nice.
much.
Thank you.